In January 2024, while Hollywood was still speaking of Gary Sinise as a symbol of American resilience, his only son quietly passed away after nearly 6 years battling a rare form of cancer. There was no public obituary, no widely announced funeral, not a single personal statement from the father who had spent a lifetime showing up for others. There was only a quietly released music album, and a man who had already withdrawn from the spotlight years before. Gary Sinise had long been a familiar face in American film and television, a co-founder of Steppenwolf Theatre at just 18, an Oscar-nominated actor, a television mainstay for decades, and Lieutenant Dan, the wounded veteran who made an entire nation fall silent. He came to represent discipline, loyalty, and a kind of heroism that never needed to be loud. And yet behind that image was a life shaped by difficult choices, silent sacrifices, and grief that was never meant to be displayed. When public speculation began to swirl about illness, finances, or baseless rumors, Gary Sinise chose silence, not out of fear, but because another battle was unfolding beyond public view. A battle with no stage, no role to play, only a father standing beside his son's hospital bed. Gary Sinise's story is not merely the journey of a gifted artist. It is the paradox of a man who, the more famous he became, the more deliberately he chose to disappear, so that the most important things in his life could remain intact. The silence Gary Sinise chose in his later years was not an impulsive reaction to aging or the fatigue of fame. It took shape much earlier, rooted in the way he grew up, the way he observed the world, and the way he learned to stand at the edge of the light even while occupying its center. Gary Sinise was born on March 17, 1955, in Blue Island, Illinois, into a family that was not wealthy but quietly influential. His father, Robert L. Sinise, worked as a film editor, a profession without glamour, rarely credited, yet one that determines the rhythm and emotional spine of an entire story. From this, Gary learned early on that true power in art does not come from being seen on screen, but from holding a story together, so it does not collapse. His childhood was marked by frequent moves, by a persistent sense of impermanence and not fully belonging anywhere. When the family settled in Highland Park, Gary entered school already out of sync. He was not a standout student, nor a model one. He struggled to focus, drifted into daydreams, and was often labeled by teachers as not paying attention. He grew up with the feeling that he was always one step behind the collective rhythm. The threat of expulsion was not an empty warning. It hovered constantly in the background. What kept him from drifting off course was his family, not through pressure, but through a quiet form of trust. No one pushed him to outperform others. No one forced him to reshape himself to fit a predefined mold. Within that space, Gary learned how to observe, how to listen, how to remain still with uncertainty without trying to cover it up by demanding attention. At 16, a moment that seemed almost trivial occurred in a school hallway. A drama teacher passed by and announced auditions for West Side Story. Gary signed up not out of artistic ambition, but from the impulsiveness of youth. The role was small, nearly weightless, but standing on stage, facing an audience, and receiving an energy he had never felt before. That moment bound him to the stage in a way that could not be undone. From that point on, acting was no longer a career choice. It became the first refuge for a boy who had grown up feeling out of sync with the world around him. The feeling of being in the right place on a high school stage did not lead Gary Sinise toward dreams of stardom. Instead, it pushed him toward a far more demanding choice, creating his own space to practice the craft on his own terms. In 1974, at just 18 years old, while many of his peers were still uncertain about school and direction, Gary, along with Terry Kinney and Jeff Perry, rented the basement of a church in Chicago, gathered old chairs and makeshift lights, and gave a name to a theater no one had heard of yet. Steppenwolf Theatre Company. There were no sponsors, no strategy for fame, only an almost reckless belief that the stage should serve the story, not the ego. Steppenwolf operated more as a discipline of living than as an artistic project. Actors were not allowed to polish themselves through roles. Everyone had to learn to stand in the right place, keep the correct rhythm, and step back when the story required it. Gary did far more than perform. He directed, edited scripts, scheduled rehearsals, mediated internal conflicts, and learned how to keep a collective from collapsing under the weight of individual ego. The earliest performances were filled with sweat and anxiety, small audiences, insufficient money, and creative pressure crushing people who were still very young. Yet, it was precisely in those harsh conditions that Gary forged something Hollywood would never teach him: the ability to take responsibility for the entire structure, not just his own role. When Steppenwolf began attracting attention in the late 1970s, particularly for its raw plays about American identity, Gary became both the axis holding things together and the one subjected to the most scrutiny. In 1982, he directed and starred in Sam Shepard's True West, a production so psychologically intense it pushed actors to dangerous emotional edges. Its success earned him an Obie Award, but it also forced him to confront a familiar paradox. The more recognition he received, the more carefully he had to restrain himself to preserve the collective spirit. As Steppenwolf grew and gathered figures who would later become icons, such as John Malkovich and Laurie Metcalf, its core philosophy never changed. No one was bigger than the story. Those years formed the professional DNA Gary Sinise would carry for life. And he became accustomed to standing behind the structure, to working more than appearing, and to believing that an artist's true value lies in endurance rather than brilliance. When the doors of Hollywood slowly opened, Gary did not step through with a conqueror's mindset. He brought with him Steppenwolf's discipline, the very discipline that taught him how to survive long-term in an industry eager to devour anyone who moves too fast. Leaving the tight but disciplined space of Steppenwolf for film, Gary Sinise did not carry ambitions of a dramatic breakthrough. He carried stage habits, reading character structure carefully, understanding internal rhythm, and accepting unflashy positions if they allowed the story to stand. In the late 1980s, he began appearing regularly in film and television, but not along the familiar path of highly sought-after faces. No glamorous leading roles, no polished star image. The characters he chose were often quiet, restrained, burdened with moral conflict and a hard-to-name sense of loneliness. Cinema treated Gary during this period with both challenge and caution. He directed Miles from Home, 1988, a heavy film about two farming brothers driven toward violence by economic collapse. And the film was selected for Cannes and drew critical attention. But its box office performance was not enough to turn him into a bankable name. That did not alter his course. He continued choosing small, abrasive projects where actors bore psychological weight rather than glory. A Midnight, Clear, and Of Mice and Men. In the early 1990s, placed him in roles of men eroded by war, poverty, and responsibility, performances unlikely to win easy affection, but impossible to ignore. The true acceleration came in 1994, when Forrest Gump was released and rapidly became a cultural phenomenon. Within a film saturated with optimism and American nostalgia, Gary Sinise appeared as its complete opposite, Lieutenant Dan, a soldier who finds no glory in survival. The character was not designed for easy sentiment. Rage, self-destruction, and the gradual acceptance of a new reality were portrayed with restraint, almost coldness. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and broad critical recognition, but it also brought a heavy burden. For the first time, his image became inseparably tied to a national symbol. Just a year later, Apollo 13 pushed him further into the orbit of collective American narratives. The film grossed more than $350 million worldwide, received multiple Oscar nominations, and once again placed Gary in the role of the man behind the shared success. Ken Mattingly was not the center, but he was the decisive piece ensuring the mission's survival. At a moment when his career could have pivoted toward box office stardom, Gary maintained his familiar rhythm, stepping back so the story could move forward. These roles did not make him shine loudly, but they cemented his reputation as an actor Hollywood could rely on when it needed trust, depth, and a realism that could not be faked. After Apollo 13, Gary Sinise did not drift into the safe orbit of familiar American hero roles. He continued to seek out characters positioned at the edges of the center, places where morality is tested and belief is never whole. In 1999, reuniting with Tom Hanks in The Green Mile, Gary entered a far heavier space than the epics that had come before. The film grossed more than $280 million worldwide and received 4 Oscar nominations. But what made his performance memorable had little to do with numbers. Within the suffocating world of the prison, Gary portrayed a man torn between rules and conscience, where every choice leaves a psychological scar. Without relying on grand climaxes, through restrained presence alone, he thickened the film's atmosphere, forcing audiences to remain with a sense of unease long after the screen went dark. And by 2000, Mission to Mars placed Gary before a different challenge: large-scale science fiction, where emotion can easily be drowned out by spectacle. The film failed to meet commercial expectations and divided critics, but for Gary, it offered a rare opportunity to explore human loneliness in the face of infinite space. His character was neither a guiding hero nor a symbol of sacrifice, but one element within a collective confronting questions larger than survival itself. Balancing technical demands, artificial environments, and inner depth made the role a tense experience, one in which he had to keep the character from dissolving into visual effects. Around the same period, Snake Eyes revealed another side of Gary Sinise. Amid fast-pacing, intrigue, and violence, he played a man whose trustworthy exterior concealed multiple layers of motive. The film did not bring major awards, but it allowed Gary to work within moral ambiguity, something that had always drawn him in. The role demanded delicate control. Even a slight misstep could have turned the character into a predictable antagonist. Gary chose to maintain a cold calm, letting moral fissures reveal themselves gradually over time. With The Human Stain, he stepped into an intellectual space shaped by conflicts of identity. The film did not make a strong box office impact, but critics noted its examination of sensitive issues within American society. Gary's role was understated, yet it placed him face to face with questions of truth and honor, and the cost of silence. The pressure did not come from difficult scenes, but from sustaining a character suspended between right and wrong, never allowed to fully lean toward either side. This sequence of roles reflected a consistent choice. Gary Sinise did not seek safety in the glow of fame. Instead, he repeatedly placed himself in gray zones, where success was measured not by revenue or awards, but by the ability to keep a story from being simplified. After a run of morally weighted films, Gary Sinise moved into television not as a step down, but as a strategic choice aligned with his working nature. When CSI New York premiered in 2004, audiences did not merely see another version of the CSI franchise. They encountered a new emotional center, Gary's Mac Taylor was not a detective defined by flamboyant intellect or eccentric personality. He was a keeper of rhythm, calm, slow, disciplined, and always placing moral questions before investigative ones. That restraint made the character trustworthy in a way long-running television rarely achieves. Across 9 seasons and more than 190 episodes, CSI-NY maintained steady viewership, at its peak drawing over 15 million viewers per episode. Gary Sinise did not aim for short-term emotional spikes. He built Mac Taylor as a man shaped by loss, carrying the aftershock of 9/11, choosing to exist through responsibility rather than speech. The character required no heavy monologues. The pain was already present in his gaze and in the timing of silence. The pressure of long-form television lies in repetition, and that was Gary's greatest challenge: how to keep a character from wearing thin over time. He solved it through subtle shifts, a slower glance, a reaction held back half a beat, just enough for viewers to feel that this man was aging alongside them. After CSI-NY concluded, Gary continued on television with Criminal Minds, Beyond Borders, a structurally demanding project that expanded its scope beyond the United States. His character, Jack Garrett, was not designed to shock or dominate the frame. He played leadership through experience rather than authority. The series did not run for many seasons, but Gary's presence remained consistent. He stood firm as a stabilizing pillar, keeping the ensemble from drifting emotionally, even as the narrative moved across cultures and borders. What stands out is that throughout this more than decade-long television period, Gary Sinise remained almost entirely absent from peripheral noise. No scandals, no controversial statements, no effort to construct a TV star persona. He arrived on set like a disciplined worker, left when the job was done, and allowed the character to speak in his place. That sustained silence led him to be seen not as the most conspicuous presence, but as the most indispensable one. The kind of actor who, if removed from the structure, would cause the entire system to lose its balance. And then every trajectory that had come before was broken the moment Forrest Gump appeared. The film was not merely a cultural phenomenon or a resounding artistic victory. With more than $670 million in global box office revenue, 6 Academy Awards, and an almost immortal place in the public memory. For Gary Sinise, it marked a professional turning point from acting into something deeper, harder to name. Lieutenant Dan was not a supporting role designed to accent the story. He was a body destroyed and a spirit crushed in full view, where war does not end when the gunfire stops, but continues to exist in every outburst of rage, every drunken collapse, every desperate look. To create that sense of loss, Gary accepted a physical ordeal that bordered on self-punishment. And his legs were wrapped tightly in green fabric so the visual effects team could erase them later. A specially designed wheelchair forced his body into misaligned positions for long stretches of time. Each take could last only a few minutes before pain spread through his back and hips, forcing production to pause. Yet the greatest brutality was not physical. It lay in having to live continuously in the state of a man who believed the only destiny meant for him had been stolen. Entering the role, Gary carried the rosary of his brother-in-law, a Vietnam veteran, not as a prop, but as a spiritual anchor, reminding himself that the pain on screen had very real roots. When the film was released, the Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor did more than recognize technical performance. It marked the moment audiences realized Lieutenant Dan was an image they had never been shown before. A veteran not romanticized, not quickly redeemed, and not transformed into a safe symbol. Thousands of letters poured in, from amputee veterans, from families who could not name the pain their loved ones carried after war. Gary Sinise did not shed the character when filming ended. He carried Lieutenant Dan out of the theater and into real life, where the role ceased to be a job and became a calling that would stretch across the rest of his life. The letters that arrived after Forrest Gump went beyond admiration for a performance. They carried concrete needs: to be heard, to be helped, to continue living in a world that had already moved on too fast. Gary Sinise began appearing in places without red carpets, without cameras, without grand introductions. He went to veterans gatherings, rehabilitation centers, small fundraising events, with the same attitude he had brought into the rehearsal rooms of Steppenwolf years earlier. Listen first, act second. There, Lieutenant Dan was no longer a film character, but a bridge, allowing difficult stories to be spoken without long explanations. After September 11th, that awareness shifted to another level. Gary met an FDNY firefighter who had survived the attacks, lost all 4 limbs, and was facing a reality harsher than medical recovery alone: the absence of a living space that allowed independent existence. With no major media campaign and no public declarations, Gary raised funds to build a home designed specifically for those needs. The process forced him to confront a cold truth. Symbolic gratitude is never enough unless it is matched by concrete, costly, long-term solutions. From that experience, the Gary Sinise Foundation was born, not as a side branch of an entertainment career, but as a rigorously run structure. The foundation focuses on wounded veterans, those carrying severe physical and psychological injuries, and families of fallen service members. Each year, and it raises more than $30 million, not through sensational campaigns, but through trust accumulated over time. A fleet of private aircraft, 12 planes, is maintained to transport wounded service members, military families, and loved ones to treatment, memorials, or reunions they could not otherwise afford. Financial reports are publicly released and regularly audited, a self-imposed discipline to prevent drifting into the moral gray zones Gary had seen too often in public life. At this point, the boundary between actor and man of action no longer existed. Gary Sinise did not stand at the center of the story. He stood within the structure so it could continue functioning even in his absence. What began as a role became a sustained chain of actions, where silence was not avoidance, but a necessary condition for seeing the work through. Through his travels meeting veterans, Gary Sinise realized there are moments when people do not need speeches or polished words of encouragement. They need a shared rhythm to breathe again. Music entered precisely that space. In 2003 to 2004, together with musician Kimo Williams, he formed the Lieutenant Dan Band, not from stage ambition, but from a very practical question: how to stay longer with people carrying too much silence. The earliest performances had no professional lighting, no ticket sales, no promotional schedules. The stages were military bases, aircraft hangars, hospital corridors, where soldiers had just come out of long surgeries. Gary stood there with his bass guitar, not introducing himself as an actor, nor trying to evoke Lieutenant Dan. The music was chosen not to showcase technique, but to draw the room closer together. Rock, pop, country, melodies familiar enough that anyone could sing along without needing to remember where they were. Over time, the Lieutenant Dan Band performed more than 400 shows at military bases at home and abroad, rehabilitation hospitals, USO events, and programs for military families. The schedule brought no commercial profit, only long flights, hurried nights of sleep, and consecutive performances under austere conditions. Some shows had to stop midway because the audience could not bear the emotions rising to the surface. Others ended in complete silence, followed only later by applause. Delayed, heavy, and deep. What kept Gary going was not the number of performances, but the moments when music achieved what words could not. When an amputee veteran tapped the beat with his remaining hand. when a young soldier laughed for the first time in months, when an entire room sang together through a simple chorus, forgetting for a few minutes what awaited them outside. There, music did not serve as entertainment. It became a tool of connection, a quiet form of healing, where Gary Sinise did not stand in front of an audience, but among them, exactly where he had chosen to stand long ago. From the long journeys with the Lieutenant Dan Band, from a life rhythm constantly oriented toward the community, there was one quiet relationship that kept Gary Sinise from drifting away from himself. Moira Harris did not enter this story as a polished, supporting figure appearing after success. She was there very early, when both of them were still standing at the threshold of an acting career at Illinois State University. They met in the same academic space, sharing the uncertainty of young people who did not yet know where the stage might lead them. Their bond did not form through grand gestures, but through seeing one another during long rehearsals, where ambition and insecurity coexisted side by side. That relationship once fell out of sync. There was a time when they planned to marry. Invitations had already been sent, and then everything stopped when Moira realized she was not yet ready to enter a life pulled along by the unstable rhythm of the profession. That pause did not erase what existed. It forced both of them to re-examine how they were living alongside each other. When they returned to one another, their decision to marry in 1981 did not carry the impulsive color of romance, but the clarity of a conscious choice, accepting a shared journey with no promise of safety. Their marriage unfolded in parallel with Gary's expanding career. Moira continued acting, appearing in projects Gary directed such as Of Mice and Men, before gradually stepping away from the spotlight in the early 2000s to stabilize family life. 3 children were born during Gary's busiest years, and their shared decision was to keep them far from public attention. That choice meant Moira carried most of the daily rhythm, ensuring the home did not turn into a transit station for shooting schedules and performances. Those years were not without friction. Financial pressure, prolonged absences, and periods when Moira had to confront personal struggles, including a battle with alcohol addiction during the 1990s, created fractures no amount of public success could conceal. Moira's decision to enter treatment and maintain sobriety from 1997 onward was not a peripheral detail, but a quiet axis that kept the family from collapsing as other forces pulled them apart. As Gary became more deeply involved in work with veterans, family life absorbed yet another strain. Moira did not stand outside that choice. She accepted a marriage in which her partner was often absent to serve others, as long as their children could grow up in a space safe enough to be free from the weight of fame. Their bond did not depend on appearing together in public, but on enduring long stretches of not being prioritized. The travels, performances, and charitable work that had defined the family's rhythm began to break apart in 2018. In a way no one could have prepared for. McKenna Anthony Sinise, known to family and friends as Max, was then playing drums in the Lieutenant Dan Band and also working directly on the technical organization of programs for veterans. Music and service were not just tasks, and they were the space where Max stood beside his father as a true partner. It was during that period that a diagnosis emerged: chordoma, an extremely rare cancer of the skull base, so rare that many physicians encounter only a few cases in an entire career. The treatment process was long and brutal, rapidly altering everything. Surgeries followed one another, high-dose radiation was used to control the tumor, and then neurological complications began to surface: chronic pain, loss of balance, declining motor and sensory function. Max clung to music as a psychological anchor, continuing to appear at some events when his health allowed, but each return came at the cost of days of exhaustion afterward. By early 2021, his body no longer permitted him to be on stage. The cessation of performances was not announced, not explained, just a quiet withdrawal the family chose to keep entirely private. At the same time, Gary Sinise vanished from public life altogether. No red carpets, no events, no statements. He withdrew from previously planned commitments and moved to Colorado to live with his son. They're close to specialized treatment centers. The decision came without announcements or public preparation. For him, everything outside suddenly became secondary to being present with his son through days that could not be predicted. The silence was not a media strategy, but a necessary condition for Max to live his final months without intrusion from public scrutiny. That absence was quickly filled with speculation. From 2021 to 2024, the Lieutenant Dan Band canceled performances without explanation. On the Foundation's website, the founder's message was removed. Social media platforms continued to post about veteran support activities, but did not mention Gary. In that informational vacuum, rumors spread in multiple directions. Cancer, financial collapse, even theories linked to #MeToo. What stood out was the near-total silence of mainstream media. No investigations, no confirmations, no denials. And from the family, not a single official statement. For some members of the public, accustomed to seeing Gary appear whenever veterans needed to be seen, his disappearance caused disappointment. For others, it created unease, as if a familiar pillar had quietly left the shared space without farewell. And the reality lay somewhere else entirely. In treatment rooms, in long days, without schedules, where a father chose to remain in the only role that still mattered, regardless of how the outside world continued to write its own stories no one in the family had the energy left to correct. The years-long silence was finally broken in 2025, not through a press conference or a prepared statement, but via two carefully chosen conversations, one with people and one on the program at home with the intuitive. Gary Sinise appeared calm, his voice carrying no need for self-defense. One by one, he closed the rumors that had surrounded him for 4 years. No illness, no bankruptcy, no allegations of any kind. The sole reason for his disappearance was stated plainly, without drama. He did what a father needed to do. The choice of silence was not an attempt to avoid the public, but a way to allow his son to live his final days without intrusive scrutiny into every breath. In that moment, the man long associated with roles and public service seemed to shrink into a smaller, yet far heavier role. After that delayed confirmation, the most painful truth was finally told in full. Max passed away after nearly 6 years of fighting illness, a journey far longer than the initial prognosis. There was no public funeral, no ritualized sharing of grief before a crowd. The family kept everything private, just as they had protected Max throughout his final years. Resurrection and Revival, the album of music Max completed during treatment, was released quietly, without a promotional campaign or lengthy introduction. Music became Max's final message, another way of existing after the body was gone. Gary Sinise did not appear in public for months afterward, declining all interviews as if words themselves had become unnecessary. When he did return, it was not to film sets or familiar stages. Gary appeared at military hospitals and bases, places long connected to the Lieutenant Dan Band. Performances resumed at a limited pace, without fanfare. Each program opened with melodies Max had written, the drums sounding like a remaining heartbeat in the room. Gary stood at the edge of the stage playing bass, no speeches, no central role. His presence was functional rather than symbolic, like someone keeping the tempo so everything would not fall into complete silence. From that loss, a new branch of work emerged, the Max Hope program. It focuses on supporting families with children facing rare diseases, covering treatment costs, travel, and long-term psychological support. In parallel, Smart Homes for Heroes expanded, and not only as a project for veterans, but as a structure aiding lives interrupted by illness and injury. Gary Sinise does not sign the messages or appear in media imagery. At the Foundation's headquarters, the only photograph displayed is not his portrait, but an image of Max seated behind a drum kit, one hand resting on an unfinished score. There, continuity needs no explanation, only quiet actions continuing exactly as Gary chose long ago. Standing behind the scenes, so the most important story can be told through deeds, not presence. What remains after this journey cannot be contained within a single role, a charitable foundation, or a humanitarian title. Gary Sinise's legacy forms along a different axis, the consistency between what he embodied on screen and how he stepped away from it when life demanded. From Steppenwolf to Hollywood, from Lieutenant Dan to military hospital rooms, he consistently chose positions that avoided noise, yet proved decisive. Not a leader of slogans, nor a symbol shielded from imperfection. Gary exists as a durable structure, one others can rely on without needing to see where he stands. In cinema, he leaves behind a rare model, a quiet, ethical man, unmoved by power or spectacle. Gary Sinise's roles do not seek affection. They compel audiences to face responsibility, loss, and consequence. Lieutenant Dan became an icon not through grandeur, but because he was allowed to break, to be angry, and to keep living without needing to triumph in a comforting way. Television carried that spirit forward, turning him into a steady anchor for long-form stories, where endurance matters more than momentary explosions. If you ever found yourself stilled by Gary Sinise's gaze as Lieutenant Dan, if you recognized that some pain does not need to shout to be present, if you believe compassion can be practiced through sustained action, leave a word of greeting for the man who chose to step back so others could stand more firmly. And if you want to continue exploring the lives lived truthfully behind the legends, support the channel, so we have reason to keep telling stories that matter.